Hello, hello, welcome back to Edgier Than Thou. The Eternals came out this week, and that means it's time to talk about it. There's a lot of discourse going on around this film in particular, especially because it is now on Rotten Tomatoes the lowest rated Marvel movie ever released. And I don't understand why that is, as you're going to see throughout the course of this review. Eternals is by no means Marvel's best. There are plenty of missteps, some of which I'm going to point to in this review, that if they had been avoided, would have made this a significantly better film. But I find it really weird that it's somehow being reviewed worse than films like Iron Man 2 and Thor 2, a film with a villain so forgettable that despite the fact that his name is almost identical to my own, I still struggle to remember it. See, Eternals does a lot right and a lot almost right. And then there's some things that they just do very poorly on. But I spent some time watching some reviews of this, curious to just see what other people were thinking about. And I noticed that the trend has continued, for lack of a better word. That trend being that the amount of hate that specifically an MCU movie gets is almost directly proportional to the amount of diversity or otherwise non-cis, white, straight, male, heteronormative, whatever, blah, 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 you know what I mean. There were at least a few of those that were the same thing. For instance, Captain Marvel, being a film that is ostensibly very feminist, got probably the most hate that any Marvel movie has ever gotten, followed by probably Black Panther, the one moment that everybody knows about in Endgame, of course, being another, right? Where it seems as though, regardless of the quality of the film, these movies get hate based on diversity. And I think that's kind of a problem when you're trying to give an objective review of a piece of media, because I, for the most part, liked this movie, but I almost had this feeling of this need to be contrarian to the people who are hating it for all of the wrong reasons, you know, and give you all the reasons why actually it's really amazing. And it's not amazing, but it has a lot of redeeming qualities that people are pretending don't exist. I think the same was true of Captain Marvel, which by all accounts was not a good film, but had some interesting moments and had some well-executed plot points that completely got brushed over because the discourse was entirely taken up by it being an SJW feminist film, right? Which again, I don't even really think it was all that much. But anyway, we saw this kind of fall apart this year with Shang-Chi when people were trying to, on a particular side of the political aisle, demonize the movie and make it out to be really bad, specifically because, well, I'll let you guess why. And then it turned out to be totally awesome. And you can see like cognitive dissonance when you go through the comment sections, because there will be, I swear to God, if you go through some of them, there will be people who are like struggling to reconcile the fact that they enjoyed an SJW film. And I just find it really funny because the only reason that this happened is because Shang-Chi was so well executed that it managed to almost brute force its way into the hearts and minds of people who ostensibly were planning on hating it. And that's not even to say that Shang-Chi was an absolutely amazing movie. It was also very flawed, but not as interesting to talk about. I mean, it was good. I really liked it. But anyway, with all that out of the way, it's time to actually talk about what happened this week with Eternals. And the first thing that you'll probably notice, at least was the first thing I noticed when, reading reviews and reading about people's experience watching the movie, and that was that it dragged. And I can see why you thought that. It was kind of slow, wasn't it? I found it for the most part pretty interesting, so it didn't affect me very much. And I also, at least on first watch, movies don't really drag that much at all for me. But I can definitely see if I were trying to rewatch this, wanting to like skip through certain parts of it because there's just so much setup. That said, there is at least some justification for the setup, even if it's not as entertaining as you might like it to be. So what is Eternals about? Well, Eternals is a film about a group of celestial space gods who worship an even bigger space god, but ultimately realize that they must defy that god in order to perform a space abortion and save the planet. That's kind of what's going on throughout this movie, is this, this debate. Should we abort the planet? Should we not, right? And I don't think that they were trying to get that metaphor out there, but that's all I can really think about when I'm thinking about this movie, so that's what I'm gonna call it. Now, the number one question that Eternals had to answer going into it was, why the hell weren't these characters involved in Avengers Infinity War, Avengers Endgame, Age of Ultron, etc.? And to the film's credit, I think it gives at least a fairly decent explanation, albeit with an ineffective delivery. So The basic explanation, and spoilers going forward, is that these characters were instructed not to involve themselves in the violent affairs of humans unless a specific race of alien creature things called deviants were in some way involved. On the surface, sounds like kind of a stupid explanation, but I do think it actually touches on something that's really interesting about that movie, and that's the characters' religious affiliations. I don't think it's at all a bad comparison to compare the way that the main characters of this film, the Eternals, believe in their all-powerful celestial creator as a god. I think that that's at the very least something that the writers were aware of, if not something they were actively intending on. And as a result, until they're pushed to their breaking point, they're basically willing to do whatever this god tells them to do. And of course, for different characters, that breaking point is different, so you begin to see different fracturing moments for each of the different characters as they go throughout it, as they eventually realize that, of course, this god figure is not benevolent. Some of them pretty quickly change their minds about the whole thing and are ready to fight against him. Some of them change their minds a little bit and are ready to question him a little bit, right? And you get to see throughout it that each character has a great amount of faith in this creator, but not enough to make them do just anything. And I think that that is at least somewhat of a worthwhile explanation for why they weren't involved in all of the other movies. That being, they were told not to interfere unless a particular race of aliens were involved. They weren't told anything, thus they didn't get involved. I do think it raises some questions. It kind of kicks the stone down the road a little bit, which is just kind of why weren't they asked by the Celestials to get involved in all of these conflicts? And I mean, I think you can come up with reasons why, but unless the movies explain it, I think that all of them are kind of cheap explanations. Like, you could say that maybe the events of Age of Ultron happened so fast that, you know, Arishem never realized and never instructed them to get involved. And I just think that, like, okay, yes, I could consider maybe that's why, but I don't see any reason why to believe that, and it kind of feels like you're just coping at that point. So I think it works well for these characters and why they didn't get involved, which is that they're just simply like religious zealots and refuse to do anything that they're not actively instructed to do. But yeah, it doesn't fully solve the problem. Something else that might have explained it is maybe some of the Celestials, mainly the big one, were killed by the Thanos snap. I don't know if that's even possible or if that's what the writers were intending. So again, cope. But ultimately, that's something that I think that Eternals does pretty well, that being characters. It doesn't give you enough time to flesh them out very much, so you don't get to know them very well throughout the course of the movie. I can't think of really a single character that I fully, deeply understood, with the possible exception of maybe Druig, who I think a lot of his character traits were pretty well showcased throughout the movie. But other than that, I don't think you got enough out of the majority of the characters. That said, I do think that they behaved realistically. As I said before, they don't all make decisions in tandem or come to beliefs in tandem. With a movie like Captain Marvel, there was sort of a loss of stakes towards the end when essentially she realized that the Kree were evil and then immediately switched sides. And that was it. There was no questioning of her ideology. There was no, refilling it with anything else. She just goes, oh, I'm working for the bad guys. Well, I guess that's it. Whereas there was a little bit of push and pull throughout this movie. And specifically, and this, I'm shocked that they did this, and it's not that big of a deal, but I really appreciated it. They didn't give the characters a full and complete triumphant, final battle scene together. There was no point where they all, at the very end, came together and did some sort of single activity. There was something sort of resembling that, but it didn't work out in the way that I expected it to, and I really appreciated that. Most notably, one of the characters just up and left, just didn't want to get involved and just left. And I don't know, I just appreciated that because, for one thing, he was the one with the most personality, so I guess I didn't appreciate that part. But I appreciated that you could see that these characters behaved like real people, and some of them were partially with it but not ready to go as far as the other ones were going, and you got kind of like a small community of people within this movie. That said, none of them were particularly well fleshed out, and so you never really got enough to totally get attached to them, which kind of sucked when a particular character was killed off, and I really wanted to be emotionally invested in it because they'd given me something slight to go off of, but there just wasn't enough there for me to fully be invested in that character's death, which yeah, just sucked. He had a lot of personality, but there just wasn't enough of him or enough character building moments to fully grasp the weight of the situation. So that was definitely a minus. Angelina Jolie's character was interesting. I think she was probably one of the most heavily billed cast members in this movie. I don't know if she's the biggest star. I don't know the vast majority of the rest of the cast, but like she was up there. And I think her character was interesting, but one that they probably did the worst job really fleshing out, because throughout the movie she has this like degenerative mental condition that never fully gets explained. There's a line in there that explains that like when her memory was being rebooted, one point all of her past memories got like collided and gave her this condition, but there was never really enough resolution to it to make it feel worthwhile. And maybe they were setting that up for a future film, but in that case I would have really appreciated some acknowledgement of that, because as it stands it feels like something they just forgot about. I don't need it to be explained in one movie. If you guys want to take more time to really flesh that out and to show us her character trying to deal with her mental health struggles and whatever, I'm totally down for that, but I guess time will tell whether or not they actually do that. I think it was smart for them to end the film not completely successful, completing their first objective but not fully finishing it out. Obviously part of that ends up just being a little bit of like sequel bait or whatever, but I do think that it was important that they didn't try to rush it all, because as it stands, this movie feels both really long and also really crammed. There's really just not enough time to fit everything in there, and if they tried to add an entire extra subplot, it would not have worked. The colors were nice for the most part. It was nowhere near the level of like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 or even like Thor Ragnarok in terms of just visual interest, but I do think it was a little bit more interesting than the average MCU movie. But I really thought that they were going to go a bit further with it, so it kind of sucked when they didn't go all out. You know, I really wanted to see like the deviants are super colorful, pretty looking animals, and I really wanted to see some more of that, but unfortunately we didn't get very much, so that's too bad. That said, the deviants were probably the weakest element of this movie anyway. So they try to give one of them the subplot of slowly becoming intelligent and learning to speak and absorbing the memories of the previous Eternals, and also realizing that because they're basically responsible for the genocide of his species, that he's meant to take revenge on them. And that subplot is resolved so poorly. I'm kind of shocked that they even resolved it at all. Honestly, I would have preferred for that character to just survive to the end of the movie and be in a future one, rather than having Angelina Jolie just kind of kill him and then walk away, and then that was it. I don't know if they were trying to give some amount of closure to her arc, because she's basically like destroying the last living memory of like her, you know, her closest friend, but it didn't feel like that, and it didn't feel like they did nearly enough with that to justify the ending that they gave it. The other antagonists of this movie are Icarus and Arishem. Icarus, again, totally should have gotten more characterization, particularly before his final moments, but I do think that he felt pretty natural as an antagonist. Again, he didn't get enough screen time or anything, but I could totally see a deeply religious character like himself struggling to deal with the consequences of his beliefs and forcing himself to potentially kill his closest friends. It almost felt like a reflection of some of the weird political stuff that we've been seeing lately, where people are going absolutely mad and like abandoning their family members because they believe that there's a cabal of Democrats that eat babies. It kind of felt a little bit like that. If you ever watch some of those interviews where they're very, very sad that they've lost their families, but are still like dead set in refusing to, you know, interact with them or speak with them until they join the Holy War. So he felt realistic. He wasn't given enough to do. And as for Arishem, of course, he's the big bad guy, the one that they don't defeat in the end. And I mean, that story's not complete, so there's not a whole lot to say, other than I think that he was entertaining to watch. And I also think it would be interesting to get to understand his motivations a little bit more. Hopefully there's something more than just like, I want to destroy the galaxy or something, because that would be lame. But hopefully they're not going to go down that route. That would be really lame. It's kind of like how at the end of WandaVision, when Monica has that moment with Wanda where she's like, they'll never know what you sacrificed for them. And everybody thought that was like just basically her justifying everything that Wanda did, and the show justifying everything that Wanda did throughout that show. I think that was actually, hopefully, based on Monica's characterization, was setting her up to be some sort of an anti-hero in the future, because it seemed like it was just basically demonstrating that she had a pretty messed up moral system. That said, I can't say for sure, but ultimately I think that if they screw this up in the future, it's not necessarily a mark against this movie that they did that. Ultimately, there's a lot more that I could talk about. As you can see, I'm pretty mixed on this one. It definitely felt a little bit too long, but also a little bit too short. So I don't know really where I would put it in terms of rankings. It's definitely above, like I said, Iron Man 2 and Thor: The Dark World. Probably also above the first Thor movie, but other than that, I don't know where else where I could reasonably put it. It's definitely not their worst. It's definitely not their best. But I also don't know if calling it mediocre is the right descriptor there, because it didn't feel mediocre. It felt like it was attempting a lot of things and just didn't fully execute them very well. But it was really ambitious, you know? It didn't feel like a movie where someone sat down and wrote it out in a day and then, filmed it the next day. Like, it felt like a lot of thought and effort was put into it, but ultimately nobody was there to pick up the pieces after it was over. So I'm not gonna give it like a star rating out of 10 or anything like that. I genuinely don't know what I could even say beyond all of this. I would recommend seeing it. It was nice to watch on a big screen, but otherwise, man, I don't know. I hope that you get something positive out of it. All that said, do the thumb thing, do the red button thing, and then, like, I don't know, watch another video, man.